July 1975. At 28 years old, with over 30 million records already sold in 2 consecutive nights at Dodger Stadium, drawing more than 110,000 people each, Elton John lay face down in his Los Angeles swimming pool after a suicide attempt. The same man who filled stadiums with screaming fans was quietly trying to disappear in his own backyard. Weeks later, he walked back on stage in glitter and feathers, smiling as if nothing had happened. How does someone worshipped by millions decide he is not worth saving? 22 years later, in 1997, the same man stood inside Westminster Abbey and sang in front of an estimated 2 billion viewers worldwide during the funeral of Princess Diana. Candle in the Wind 1997 would go on to sell more than 33 million copies, becoming one of the best-selling singles in music history. By then, Elton John had sold over 300 million records. He had dominated the 1970s with albums like Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. He had rewritten the rules of stage performance: platform boots, crystal-covered glasses, piano spinning under stadium lights. In 1994, he won an Academy Award for Can You Feel the Love Tonight? In 2020, he won another Oscar for I'm Gonna Love Me Again. 5 decades at the top, multiple Grammys. Knighted by the Queen in 1998, to the world, he was unstoppable. A global icon who turned pain into melody and spectacle into empire. But here's the contradiction. The louder the applause became, the less secure he felt. Behind the costumes and sold-out tours was Reginald Dwight, the shy boy who never felt approved by his father. If a man can win Oscars, break sales records, and command billions of eyes on a single performance, why was he still trying to prove he deserved love? Reginald Kenneth Dwight was born on March 25, 1947, in Pinner, Middlesex, a quiet suburb in northwest London. The house was modest, structured, orderly. His father, Stanley Dwight, was a Royal Air Force officer, disciplined and emotionally distant. His mother, Sheila, loved music and brought records into the home. The marriage was tense, often cold, and affection was not something openly displayed. There were no dramatic public scandals in that household, no headlines, no visible chaos. But there was something quieter and, in many ways, more lasting: emotional absence. Stanley believed in stability, hierarchy, and traditional masculinity. Music, especially pop music, was not a serious path. When young Reg demonstrated an unusual ability to play piano by ear at the age of 4, it did not bring celebration from his father. It brought indifference. Approval never came easily. Stanley rarely attended his son's performances. Praise was scarce. Validation was conditional. Reg absorbed this silently. He became observant, inward, cautious. He discovered that when he sat at the piano, the tension in the house softened. Music became more than a hobby. It became control. It became attention. At 11 years old, he earned a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music. That was not a small achievement for a working-class boy in post-war Britain. It meant hours of classical training, strict discipline, and formal technique. But even this milestone did not repair the fracture between father and son. Success did not translate into warmth. In 1962, when Reg was 15, his parents divorced. The separation ended the daily tension, but it did not answer the deeper question forming inside him. Why was love so difficult to secure? Why did achievement not guarantee acceptance? The absence of his father did not erase the need for approval. It amplified it. As adolescence progressed, another layer of isolation formed. Reg became aware that he was different. His sexuality did not align with the expectations of his environment. Britain in the early 1960s was not a forgiving place for young men questioning their identity. Homosexuality would not be partially decriminalized until 1967. Silence was safer. Secrecy was survival. Music offered an escape from that internal tension. He studied Chopin and Bach by day, but listened to Little Richard and Elvis Presley at night. He learned how rhythm could command attention. He learned how performance could transform perception. On stage, he could be bold, loud, exaggerated. Off stage, he remained unsure, anxious, still craving affirmation that never fully arrived at home. The pattern was forming early. When he played well, People clapped. When people clapped, he felt seen. When he felt seen, the emptiness receded, at least temporarily. It was a simple equation that would shape the rest of his life. Achievement equals applause. Applause equals validation. Validation equals safety. But what happens when applause becomes the only language you trust? Reginald Dwight was not yet Elton John. He was a gifted boy carrying quiet insecurity, disciplined training, and an unresolved hunger to be approved. He did not yet know that he would build an entirely new identity to survive that hunger, but the foundation was already there. If love could not be guaranteed for who he was, perhaps it could be earned by becoming someone unforgettable. By the mid-1960s, Reginald Dwight was living a double rhythm. By day, he followed classical discipline at the Royal Academy of Music. By night, he immersed himself in American rock and rhythm and blues. He joined a local band called Bluesology, playing pubs and backing touring soul artists. The venues were small, smoky, crowded. The pay was inconsistent. But for the first time, he felt the raw exchange between performer and audience. The louder he played, the stronger the reaction. The stronger the reaction, the safer he felt. In 1967, he answered an advertisement placed by Liberty Records seeking new songwriters. The same envelope of lyrics was sent to another young hopeful, Bernie Taupin. They had never met. Yet their partnership would define modern pop songwriting. Taupin wrote the words. Reg wrote the melodies. It was efficient, almost surgical. Emotion translated into structure. Structure translated into songs. Songs translated into applause. That same year, Reginald made a decision that went beyond music. He changed his name. Elton John was formed from two members of Bluesology, Elton Dean and Long John Baldry. It sounded stronger, cleaner, more stage-ready. But this was not just branding. It was separation. Reginald Dwight belonged to Quiet House and Pinner, to the distant father, to the boy who felt unseen. Elton John belonged to stage. In 1970, the self-titled album Elton John introduced him to the world. Your Song became a breakthrough hit in both the UK and the United States. The melody was simple. The lyrics were intimate. The performance felt vulnerable. Yet even in vulnerability, there was construction. Every appearance was calculated. Every interview sharpened the persona. He was learning that authenticity on stage could still be a performance. As fame accelerated, the divide widened. Elton became flamboyant. Brighter clothes, larger glasses, more theatrical gestures at the piano. The spectacle grew because spectacle protected him. If audiences focused on the costume, they would not look too closely at the insecurity underneath. If they celebrated the eccentric genius, they would not question the quiet fear of rejection still living inside him. Behind the scenes, another tension persisted. His sexuality remained private. The world was changing slowly, but not fast enough to make disclosure safe. So he navigated interviews carefully, relationships discreetly, and public appearances strategically. The applause continued. The image solidified. By the early 1970s, Elton John was no longer an emerging artist. He was becoming an international phenomenon. But the architecture of his success was built on a fragile logic, that the character must always be stronger, louder, brighter than the man who created him. If Elton slowed down, Reginald's doubts might surface. So the character kept expanding. At what point does a stage name stop being a choice and start becoming a mask you cannot remove? Between 1972 and 1975, Elton John moved at a pace few artists in modern music have ever matched. In 1973 alone, he released Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player, and then Goodbye, Yellow Brick Road, an ambitious double album recorded in France in just weeks. The album would eventually sell more than 30 million copies worldwide. Songs like Rocket Man, Benny and the Jets, and Candle in the Wind did not just climb charts. They became cultural markers of the decade. By 1974, Elton John was placing albums at #1 on the Billboard charts repeatedly. He appeared on major television programs in the United States, collaborated with John Lennon at Madison Square Garden, and became one of the highest-paid touring artists in the world. He was in his mid-20s. The acceleration was relentless. Studio sessions bled into rehearsals. Rehearsals bled into international flights. The demand for new material never paused. Then came October 25th and 26th, 1975. Dodger Stadium, Los Angeles. 2 sold-out nights. More than 110,000 people in total. Elton walked onto the field wearing a sequin Los Angeles Dodgers uniform, custom-made, glittering under stadium floodlights. Platform boots elevated him physically above the piano. Oversized glasses reflected camera flashes like mirrors. The piano itself gleamed white against the California night sky. The image was designed for mythology. Those concerts were not just performances. They were declarations. Elton John was no longer a promising British singer-songwriter. He was a global spectacle. The press described him as fearless, outrageous, unstoppable. His wardrobe grew more extravagant with each tour. Feathered costumes, rhinestone-covered jackets, capes stretching behind him like royal robes. The stage identity expanded because the public rewarded expansion. Every layer of flamboyance generated headlines. Every headline strengthened the persona. Money followed. Multi-million-dollar recording contracts. Lavish homes in both the UK and the United States. A lifestyle that moved far beyond the modest house in Pinner, where Reginald Dwight once practiced scales alone. On the surface, it appeared as if every childhood insecurity had been erased by scale. He had not just proven his father wrong about music as a career. He had built an empire from it. But the structure of that empire carried pressure. Success was no longer an achievement to celebrate. It became a benchmark to defend. Each album had to outperform the previous one. Each tour had to feel bigger than the last. If one show dipped in energy, critics noticed. If a single charted lower than expected, speculation began. The industry machine did not slow down because its leading figure felt tired. It demanded repetition at the highest level. Privately, the schedule took a toll. Sleep patterns fractured. Diet became inconsistent. Emotional fatigue accumulated quietly. Elton's public persona thrived on brightness and exaggeration. Offstage, however, he remained vulnerable to doubt. Applause lasted minutes. Reviews lasted days. But insecurity could last indefinitely. The paradox deepened. The larger Elton John became a symbol. The less room there was for Reginald Dwight to exist. Interviews reinforced the character. Photo shoots exaggerated it. Television appearances amplified it. The more the public adored the spectacle, the more necessary the spectacle felt. Scaling back would not just mean artistic change. It would risk disappointing millions. There is a psychological cost when identity merges with performance. If audiences respond most intensely to the boldest version of you, that version becomes mandatory. Vulnerability must be rehearsed. Confidence must be constant. Doubt must be hidden. Over time, the line between authentic expression and survival strategy blurs. By the mid-1970s, Elton John was operating at the center of global pop culture. Stadiums full, charts conquered, image perfected, yet the rhythm that began in childhood remained unchanged. Achievement equals approval. Approval equals temporary safety. Temporary safety requires more achievement. The spotlight was brighter than ever. The applause was deafening. The persona was secure. But beneath the sequins and spectacle, exhaustion was building. If success depends on never stepping out of character, what happens when the character becomes too heavy to carry? The fracture did not begin publicly. It began chemically. By the mid-1970s, cocaine had entered Elton John's routine. At first, it was recreational, a stimulant that matched the velocity of touring life. Late nights, constant travel, pressure to remain energetic on stage. Cocaine did not slow him down. It amplified him. It sharpened confidence. It erased hesitation. For a man who feared inadequacy, that temporary invincibility felt useful. But usefulness turned into dependency. By his own later admissions, he could spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single week on drugs. What began as enhancement became requirement. The stage persona demanded intensity. The drugs guaranteed it. Alcohol followed. So did compulsive shopping. Mansions filled with unused objects. Closets crowded with designer clothes never worn twice. It was not indulgence for pleasure. It was distraction from emptiness. Each purchase provided a brief surge of control. Each high provided a brief escape from anxiety. Behind the glamour, another secret was taking shape. Elton developed bulimia, a condition rarely discussed among male celebrities at the time. After meals, he would purge. It was about control, about shame, about punishing the body that felt perpetually inadequate. On stage, he was flamboyant and fearless. In private, he was deeply critical of himself. In 1975, the pressure converged. He attempted suicide by placing his head in a gas oven. The attempt failed. Later that year, another incident would occur, lying at the bottom of his swimming pool in Los Angeles after taking an overdose. The image is difficult to reconcile with the sequin Dodger Stadium icon, yet both existed simultaneously. How does a man capable of commanding 110,000 people feel so powerless alone? Part of the answer lay in relationships. John Reed, his manager and romantic partner during the 1970s, held enormous influence over both business and personal decisions. The relationship was intense, passionate, but increasingly volatile. Power blurred with intimacy. Financial control intersected with emotional dependency. The more Elton's empire expanded, the more entangled his private and professional worlds became. And then there was identity. Throughout the 1970s, Elton navigated public ambiguity about his sexuality. In 1976, he told Rolling Stone he was bisexual. It was a bold statement for its time, but not a full acknowledgement of self. Public perception shifted. Some audiences embraced him. Others recoiled. Record sales in certain markets dipped. The industry calculated risk. For someone whose validation depended on mass approval, even minor rejection felt catastrophic. The divide between Elton John and Reginald Dwight widened. Elton was adored. Reg felt exposed. Elton could perform outrageously. Reg feared abandonment. Drugs became anesthesia against that fear. By the early 1980s, the momentum that once felt unstoppable began to slow. Musical trends shifted. New wave and synthpop altered the landscape. Elton still recorded and toured, but critical reception was less unanimous. Commercial dominance was no longer automatic. The machine that once propelled him forward began to sputter. In 1984, he married Renate Blau, a German recording engineer. The wedding took place in Australia. The announcement shocked many, especially given his earlier comments about sexuality. To the public, it appeared as a conventional step: stability, maturity, respectability. Privately, it was confusion crystallized. Elton would later describe the marriage as an attempt to create a normal life, to suppress the internal conflict, to align external image with societal expectation. But suppression rarely resolves tension. It intensifies it. The marriage lasted 4 years. The emotional strain deepened. Cocaine use escalated. There were periods where he reportedly used the drug every 4 hours. Days blurred. Nights extended. Interviews became erratic. Behavior grew unpredictable. And still, the persona endured. Costumes remained elaborate. Performances remained energetic. Audiences often saw no sign of collapse. The stage functioned as insulation. As long as the music continued, the crisis could be postponed. But postponement is not prevention. In 1988, Elton underwent throat surgery in Australia. Doctors removed nodules from his vocal cords. His voice permanently lowered in tone afterward. It was a medical necessity, but symbolically it felt like transformation. The instrument that carried him to global fame had been altered. Another reminder that even the strongest personas are physically fragile. By 1990, exhaustion could no longer be masked. The addiction cycle was unsustainable. Emotionally, he described himself as lonely despite constant company. Surrounded by employees, collaborators, fans, yet internally isolated. He had built an identity to avoid abandonment, yet the identity itself had become isolating. That year, after the death of a young friend from AIDS, the confrontation with mortality intensified. The epidemic was devastating the creative communities around him. Grief broke through denial. Cocaine no longer numbed effectively. The pattern of self-destruction was no longer abstract. It was visible in funerals. In July 1990, Elton John entered a rehabilitation center in Chicago. He was 43 years old. For the first time in decades, he stopped performing the character long enough to examine the man underneath. No sequins, no stage, no audience, just therapy sessions and withdrawal symptoms. He would later describe this as the most important decision of his life. But the question remains, why did it take near-death experiences, failed marriage, addiction spirals, and public contradiction for him to confront himself? Why is it often easier to construct an empire than to dismantle a mask? The collapse was not one dramatic explosion. It was accumulation of applause without intimacy, of success without security, of spectacle without self-acceptance. Elton John had built a character to survive childhood insecurity. That character conquered the world. Yet survival strategy eventually became prison. When the persona that once protected you begins to suffocate you, how do you learn to live without it? When Elton John checked into rehabilitation in 1990, it was not a publicity stunt. There were no sequins, no stage lights, no applause waiting at the end of the corridor. For the first time since his teenage years, he was forced to sit still. No touring schedule, no recording deadlines, no persona to perform. Just Reginald Dwight in a room, facing the silence he had spent decades outrunning. Rehabilitation stripped away the illusion of control. Withdrawal was physical, but the deeper work was psychological. Therapy required honesty, honest conversations about childhood, about the distance from his father, about the fear of not being enough, about how addiction had functioned as armor. Cocaine had not been about pleasure. It had been about numbing insecurity. Alcohol had not been celebration. It had been sedation. In those sessions, he began to separate the character from the person. Elton John was a construct, powerful, dazzling, commanding. Reginald Dwight was vulnerable, anxious, still seeking approval. For decades, the two had fused. Now, they had to coexist without one consuming the other. He also confronted grief. The AIDS crisis had taken friends, collaborators, members of the creative community he loved. Death was no longer abstract. It was close and recurring. Instead of self-destruction, he began channeling energy into purpose. In 1992, he founded the Elton John AIDS Foundation. What started as charity grew into one of the most influential HIV/AIDS organizations in the world, raising hundreds of millions of dollars over the following decades. Sobriety altered not just his habits, but his relationships. He ended toxic dynamics. He reevaluated loyalty. He learned boundaries. For a man who once equated validation with survival, learning to say no was revolutionary. Approval from millions no longer mattered if self-respect was absent. In 1993, he met David Furnish. Their relationship developed gradually, grounded not in spectacle but in stability. For someone whose previous connections were entangled with management, publicity, or secrecy, this was different. It was not about image. It was about partnership. They would later enter a civil partnership in 2005 and marry in 2014 after same-sex marriage became legal in the UK. The man who once had parts of himself behind costumes now stood publicly in authenticity. Musically, the rebirth did not diminish his impact. In 1994, he won an Academy Award for Can You Feel the Love Tonight from The Lion King. In 1997, after the tragic death of Princess Diana, he performed a revised version of Candle in the Wind at her funeral before a global audience estimated at 2 billion viewers. The single went on to sell over 33 million copies. But this time, the applause did not feed insecurity. It accompanied purpose. The difference was internal. Before 1990, success validated existence. After 1990, existence did not depend on success. The stage remained. The costumes remained, though less extreme. The voice, deeper after surgery, carried maturity instead of frantic urgency. Sobriety did not erase vulnerability. It integrated it. Elton no longer needed to exaggerate himself to feel visible. He could be flamboyant without being fragmented. He could perform without hiding. The rebirth was not about abandoning the character. It was about reclaiming authorship over it. Elton John remained an icon, but Reginald Dwight was no longer exiled beneath the surface. For decades, He had built spectacle to survive. Now he was learning to live without using spectacle as shield. When the mask is no longer necessary, does a performance become more honest or simply quieter? After sobriety, Elton John did not disappear. He stabilized. The difference is subtle but significant. Stability meant fewer headlines about chaos and more focus on longevity. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, he continued releasing albums, touring internationally and collaborating with younger artists. The pace was no longer self-destructive. It was sustainable. In 1998, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II for his services to music and charity. The boy whose father once doubted music as a career now carried the title Sir. Recognition had come in a form even traditional institutions could not dismiss. Yet by that point, the external validation mattered less than the internal equilibrium he had fought to achieve. The Elton John AIDS Foundation expanded globally, funding prevention, treatment, and anti-stigma programs in dozens of countries. By the 2020s, the organization had raised more than $450 million. This was not symbolic activism. It was structural intervention. His fame opened doors. His resources sustained impact. For someone who once used performance to escape insecurity, using influence to confront suffering represented transformation. Family life redefined his priorities. With David Furnish, he built a home environment far removed from the isolation of his early years. They became parents to 2 sons through surrogacy in 2010 and 2013. Fatherhood reframed legacy. It was no longer about chart positions or costume design. It was about presence, about being emotionally available in ways he had once missed as a child. In 2018, he launched the Farewell Yellow Brick Road Tour, announced as his final world tour. It stretched over 5 years, concluding in 2023 after more than 300 shows. The tour grossed over $900 million, becoming one of the highest-grossing tours in history. The scale was monumental, but the tone was reflective rather than frantic. He was not chasing dominance. He was closing a chapter deliberately. In 2020, he won his 2nd Academy Award for I'm Gonna Love Me Again, reinforcing that his relevance spanned generations. But unlike the 1970s, awards no longer functioned as proof of worth. They were acknowledgments of contribution. The cultural impact of Elton John extends beyond record sales, estimated at more than 300 million worldwide. He helped normalize flamboyance in mainstream pop. He challenged expectations around masculinity in performance. He navigated public conversations about sexuality during decades when openness carried risk. Yet the most significant legacy may be less visible. It is a demonstration that reinvention is possible without self-erasure. That addiction can be confronted. That identity can be claimed publicly after years of concealment. That childhood wounds, while formative, do not have to be destiny. The character of Elton John once existed to protect Reginald Dwight from rejection. In later years, the two identities aligned rather than collided. The spectacle remained, but it no longer functioned as armor. It became expression. When history evaluates Elton John, it will count awards, sales, and tours. But the deeper measure may be different. Not how brightly he performed, but how honestly he eventually chose to live. Elton John's life reads like contrast. Stadiums and solitude, sequins and silence, applause and anxiety. The numbers are undeniable. Hundreds of millions of records sold, 2 Academy Awards, decades at the center of global culture. Yet, numbers never tell the full story. At its core, this is the story of a child who sought approval and built an empire to secure it. The persona worked. It conquered charts and filled arenas. But survival strategies do not always scale safely. What protects you at 14 can imprison you at 28. The turning point was not fame. It was confrontation. Confronting addiction. Confronting grief. Confronting the fear of being unlovable without performance. Rehabilitation did not erase the character of Elton John. It rebalanced it. The mask became optional rather than essential. There's a quiet lesson in that transformation. Achievement can amplify insecurity if insecurity remains unexamined. Spectacle can distract from pain, but cannot resolve it. Identity built solely on applause becomes fragile when the applause fades. Elton John proved that reinvention is not about abandoning who you were. It is about integrating who you try to hide. When the final curtain falls and the lights dim for the last time, what remains is not the costume or the headline. It is a question every performer must eventually answer in private. If no one is watching, are you still enough?